So the slave revolt is a moment of political genius, says Nietzsche, by Jesus. And what happens in the slave revolt is that, confronted by the massive military power and authority of the Romans, Jesus does something subversive, like profoundly subversive. It's successful, but it's subversive. And Nietzsche talks about a very powerful human emotion called resentment, or ressentiment, he calls it. He uses the French word. Or we could just say anger. So this anger, which the Jews had towards the Romans, couldn't be released onto the Romans. They couldn't be delivered onto them because they'd just get squashed. In fact, some of those zealots who revolted back before Jesus, well, they got crushed by the Romans. They were crucified upside down, their bodies left to rot by the walls of Jerusalem. The Romans were totally intolerant of any kind of rebellion. So what do you do then with your anger? If you can't express an anger towards a power which is so much bigger than you, so much more powerful, if you can't even express it and put it on the man, where does it go? Well, Nietzsche says you can't get rid of it. This energy can't just be dissolved. It has to go somewhere. So Nietzsche says what Jesus does is that he turns that anger which should be expressed externally, it gets flipped and it lands on the Jews themselves as guilt. So this anger energy is flipped and is discharged onto the self. Now, this rebellion's got an extra layer to it, and for this I need to turn to talk about my daughter, because actually she was born on the 15th of October, just like Nietzsche. Maybe she had an insight from that, who knows. But anyway, my daughter, when she was little, she was being particularly, it was a naughty phase, let's say. She was being particularly naughty, and we told her that she couldn't go to a party if she carried on being so rebellious and disruptive and so on. And she carried on and she pushed the limits, and so of course as parents then you have to follow through on what you say, and we said okay, no party. This then caused an even greater explosion of anger. Now of course we are parents, we're not going to move, so where does this anger go? Well, after a few minutes, the noise, the slamming of the doors and all the other noises are associated. She wasn't like throwing plates or anything, but she calmed down, and then she just came very calmly to me and she said, "You know what, Papa? I didn't want to go anyway." Now that gesture, where you have no power of, I didn't even want to go, that internalization of the problem, that is an extremely Nietzschean move. What she was doing was she was saying, I don't even want what you've got. I want the opposite. And that was extremely empowering. In a situation where she was completely disempowered, she suddenly became powerful. Like she was the one that was making the decision. I didn't want to go anyway. And this is what Nietzsche says happens in the slave revolt with the Jews and the Romans, masterminded by Jesus. That the Jews couldn't have power and wealth. They couldn't have status. They couldn't have property. They couldn't decide their own laws. All of that was off limits for them and impossible for them to get it back. So what did they do? They just said, we don't even want that anyway. We want the opposite. We want humility. We want poverty. We want kindness and vulnerability. These are the new values. The old Greco-Roman values of wealth, power and status and so on is rejected, and its opposite becomes the new set of values. And this turn, says Nietzsche, this slave revolt is what has carried on and has taken us today and eventually to this. We live in a world, in an ethical world, in which everything got turned on its head. And this was the empowering move, says Nietzsche, that the Jews did during this slave revolt. And it was a moment of genius, because it was kind of untouchable for the... What can you do then? What could the Romans do? And of course, Christianity spread like wildfire throughout the Roman Empire.
You look so happy, bring down the government. They don't speak for us.
So this is Nietzsche's analysis in the Genealogy of Morals. He writes with incredible kind of visceral tempo and emotion. It's a remarkable text. And this is a tremendous insight, I think, for how it might help us decode some climate change ethics. And this ethics, especially of the internal individual action. So in climate change, when we are confronted by monumental forces, both environmental forces, in terms of these massive systems which might start failing or collapsing, like the AMOC or the Amazon rainforest or the permafrost or the West Antarctic ice sheet and so on, confronted by these massive environmental systems and confronted by massive political systems, economic and social systems, and we just become useless in this. The more you think about it, the bigger these systems get in a way, the more disempowered you get. Well, remembering Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals in some ways helps us to think, well, what is the individual action and is the individual guilt associated with it? Is that the best way forward? Now, I'm not saying, of course, that we shouldn't be concerned about our own individual carbon footprint. Of course, I don't have a car. I try to eat as little meat as possible, and so on and so on. All those things, in a way, should be just a given to the way in which we respond to the crisis. But it's not the end point. This is not to invalidate any individual action, but it's to first of all diagnose what the psychological root of it might be, in a kind of a way of internalizing anger. The lesson of Nietzsche, what Nietzsche's philosophy is all about, is the opposite of negating the self. So Nietzsche's philosophy, although it's quite hardcore at the beginning, although Nietzsche's philosophy is kind of vandalistic and iconoclastic and quite radical, at the end of the day, it's not a negative philosophy. Nietzsche's philosophy is an extremely affirming, life-affirming philosophy. Can be summed up in the notion of the yes to life, the affirmation of life. And this part of Nietzsche is an important antidote to that kind of negative energy that you get from just focusing on less this, less that, and the individual guilt that is associated with the individual carbon footprint. Now, of course, there are no simple solutions to the systemic change. There was no simple way in which the Jews could overthrow the Romans. But that's a different question. Those questions of systemic change are for another day, in a way. What we need to do is have this kind of open ability to be able to criticize and decode our social responses to the climate crisis. And that opens up new pathways, it opens up new ways of thinking. And yes, you have to be brave. Yes, you have to be able to confront and look at situations which are really, in many ways, overwhelming. But that doesn't mean that we don't do it. Nietzsche is a very brave philosopher, and I think we can learn from him that just as a first step, as a first gesture towards the crisis, is not to shrink only within ourselves and to shrink our actions and our thinking just down to an individual level and to a level of individual guilt. Because Nietzsche would say that it's an understandable psychological reaction, but it's not a healthy one.